This program is made possible in part by the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, one of America's top research universities, preparing students for today's interdependent world with internationally focused academic and outreach programs. The Institute of World Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee presents International Focus, a weekly discussion of the people and events behind today's global headlines. Now, here's your host, Doug Savage.
Welcome to International Focus. Donald Trump's proposed federal budget includes major cuts to the U.S. State Department and its foreign aid programs. Supporters say these tough love cuts will foster greater efficiency and effectiveness. Opponents argue they'll undermine U.S. diplomacy, making the world less democratic and America less safe. Today, we'll take a look at the business of diplomacy, what it costs, and what we as taxpayers get for our money. Our guest is Ambassador Peter Romero, president of Experior Advisory, a Washington-based international consulting firm. Previously, he had a distinguished career with the U.S. State Department, culminating with the position of Assistant Secretary of State under Presidents Bill Clinton and George Bush. Ambassador Romero, welcome to International Focus.
Thank you, Doug, and it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Well, one thing that I think is often not well understood is, first of all, what we mean by the foreign affairs budget. I mean, what is covered in that line item?
Well, there's a lot that's covered. Americans get a big bang for their buck. Everything from stopping pandemics in their tracks in those foreign places where they tend to break out, to controlling the flow of illegal immigrants into the United States from their host countries, sending countries, so to speak, to funding in Colombia to help with achieving peace there, safe food imported into the United States, keeping the air, the land, and the sea that we all share as healthy as we possibly could make it, implementing the 10-year accord with the Iranians so that they will not be able to produce nuclear weapons or even accrue those materials that are precursors to it. There's just so much that we do with 1% of the budget. That's 1% of the budget. That most people don't even see how much we do because we do so much that doesn't happen. When you go overseas and you get sick or something happens to a family member and you need to get in touch or whatever, we're there to help you. We're there to serve Americans, American interests, and Americans abroad. And the cut that President Trump was contemplating would have been terribly draconian. It would have cut into the bone of a lot of programs that we have, but particularly reduced the size of the Foreign Service dramatically. And of course, our ability to be able to provide services to the American people, like promoting jobs and investment in this country that creates jobs and exports overseas.
So that's not at all the popular conception of what this costs. Why do you think that is? I mean, if you ask the average person, I mean, reporters have done this from time to time, what portion of the federal budget does this represent? You get things that are typically much in excess of 1%.
I've even heard people say that they thought it was 30 to 40%. No, it is 1%. I don't know why there is this general sense that it's much larger than it is. But I think that there's a lot of room for people in the foreign affairs community in Washington, and particularly our diplomats, to reach out to the American people. For a long, long time, it was really prohibited from basically explaining to the American people, and this was written into law, what it is we do overseas, because there was a very strong sense that we didn't want to propagandize people in our home country, and I get that. But there really is a crying need for people to understand how much bang they get for their buck, and that 1% and how far it goes. If I was to tell you that with 1% of your budget, we would be able to ensure that your house in a group of houses wouldn't catch fire on the basis of getting caught in the fire from another house, and I could guarantee that, or pretty much guarantee that, I think you'd be willing to spend that 1 penny on the dollar, and that's what we're talking here.
So one of the rationale that the administration has put forth is for these cuts is they're offsetting increases in the defense budget, and so there is in some circles this sense that it is a zero-sum game, that we have to take it from the state side of the house and give it to the Pentagon. But Defense Secretary Mattis famously said, if you enact these cuts, he's going to have to buy more ammunition. What do you think he meant by that?
Well, I think what he meant by that, Doug, is that there would be less capability that we would have to try to mitigate armed conflict or prevent armed conflict from taking place in the beginning. And I think he's right on that, but I think the explanation only goes so far. If you take a very large budget, which is a Department of Defense budget, we spend more than the next 7 countries in our defense budget. Okay, we have no peer or even near peer in terms of our superiority in the amount of money that we spend. President Trump wanted to spend another $54 billion in addition to what the Department of Defense already gets. It was not asked for, it was not requested, and it's not needed. And to take that amount of money or a portion of that money out of the State Department budget that goes into preventing the kind of things that can go bump and bad in the night is just short-sighted. My father used to always tell me, if the only tool in the toolbox is a hammer, that's what you're going to use. And in this case, with respect to international problems, if the only tool that's funded is a hammer, you're going to keep using a hammer. And quite frankly, the world today requires a whole lot more nuance and a whole lot more understanding and a whole lot less big stick.
So, we have several orders of magnitude more defense spending in the United States. How does the spending in the State Department and diplomacy more generally compare to what other sort of industrialized Western countries spend?
I think that of the top 20 industrialized countries, or at least the OECD members, okay, we spend less of a percentage of our GDP on foreign affairs and foreign assistance than any other developed country. So already we're talking about, in comparison to other countries, a very low budget. Countries like Sweden and Norway and Denmark, they tend to spend a whole lot more. We are at the low end of developed countries. And we're not asking for the taxpayer to fork over more money. That's not what the State Department needs. What it needs is a better share of the apportioned monies that are already set aside by taxpayers to pay for their government, and to not be short-sighted in terms of what this country needs in terms of its own diplomats. All of that having been said, I think Americans diplomats need to do a much better job with explaining to the American people what it is we do and how we do it and the successes that we've had.
So, one of the sort of dichotomies that's often bandied about these days is hard power versus soft power. And this is clearly, if it were to become the actual budget, a hard power budget. But what do we mean by soft power? And hard power is pretty easy to understand. We go and blow things up and kill bad guys. And, what does soft power look like?
Well, that's a good question. In fact, the new director of management and budget came out the other day when he unveiled the Trump budget, and said, which had these significant cuts for the State Department and additions to the Department of Defense, and he said, this is a hard power budget. We're not going to get into soft power. We're diminishing the role of soft power. This is a hard power budget. I wish the world were as simple as it was in World War II, where you decisively defeat your enemies and they declare surrender and you rebuild and everybody goes home. It doesn't happen that way anymore. Defeated armies, vanquished armies, if not treated properly in terms of their demobilization, go into the waterwork and come back at you as insurgents. Countries that are failing states and provide ungoverned spaces for these same kinds of actors, these armed actors, these bad guys, again, another problem. So we have a choice as Americans in terms of the kind of global problems or the global challenges that we're facing. And that is, do we engage, and do we engage diplomatically in a robust way, or do we pull back and huddle inside of Fortress America and use the only tool in the toolbox, which is the Department of Defense and the hammer?
So let's...
let me finish answering your question. Soft power. Soft power is not coercion and hostility, the kind of what the Department of Defense famously calls kinetic action. Okay, it's not that. It's not blowing things up. It's not shooting. What it is through persuasion and attraction. You're hoping to influence the behavior of your adversary or your allies or whoever seems to be or happens to be sitting on the other side of that table, in a way that reaches out to their publics, reaches out to their news media, reaches out to those leaders themselves to get them to better understand where it is we're coming from and who we are and what we're looking for. You can't do diplomacy the way we used to do diplomacy up until about 20 years ago, behind closed doors, and expect that deals are done and cracked, and publics will accept it. Publics demand to know. You need to work with the publics out there. It has to be a combination, a great mix of attracting them to whatever it is your model is or your goals and objectives, and also persuading them into the right course of action. And it's not easy. It's difficult. But it's a whole lot better than shooting your way into it and try to shoot your way out of it.
Well, let's just look at some of the specific situations you've touched on here. You mentioned failing or weak states, and how does that 1% help us on that front?
Well, you've got states around the world, Doug, that can't control what's happening in their own borders. And the way the world is today with globalization, when you have a weak or failing state that has that produces what's known as ungoverned spaces, you have a collection of bad actors that tend to accumulate there, from Mexican cartels in ungoverned spaces in Mexico, to terrorists in Afghanistan, to insurgents and terrorists in Iraq, to bad actors and Iranians in Yemen. These are places that Somalia, I mean, the list goes on. These are places where the government is not able to exert control, and it's up to us and our allies to support the efforts of responsible people in those governments and in factions in those countries to try to get a better handle on law and order. Number one, provide security for all the people, and to do the kind of reforms necessary to become legitimate in the eyes of the governed. That's tall order. It's a tall order in any single country, and yet we've got about a dozen right now that are facing the same situation. And it just requires a lot of diplomacy, a lot of cultural understanding about what goes on, a lot of experience in terms of what has happened in other countries that's worked, and working very closely with people in those countries that can show them the kind of respect and understanding that they deserve, so that you can get this thing turned around. But without doing that, with the only tool in the toolbox, as I mentioned, is to wait until things get so bad you have no alternative but to strike militarily, only makes it worse over the long run.
So how does that work? And in a place like Somalia, what would a diplomat be up to?
Well, I'm not sure we have an embassy in Somalia anymore, but our diplomats are active with special forces and training local police and constabulary and military there to try to safeguard the elected government in that country, to try to mitigate the effects of Somali pirates that are hijacking vessels on the high seas, to fight against al-Shabaab, which is an indigenous group, insurgent fundamentalist group in that country, to set up courts, to try to set up the functioning and services of government. All of this with allies, all of this with experts from the military side, but also the diplomatic side, that have been in these kinds of situations before. They know what works. They're culturally attuned to what's going on. They place themselves in harm's way, and they get the job done. And they run the same risks that our military does, only in the case of diplomats, they go into these hostile places unarmed. And there is 2 walls in the State Department replete with a couple of hundred names of diplomats that have lost their lives over the last 2 centuries of our republic, and the vast majority of them in the last 25 years due to terrorist acts. So these are a dedicated cadre of Americans who spend most of their lives working on behalf of the United States overseas and in many very critical and high conflict areas.
So what about non-human threats? I'm thinking of pandemic. So, how does the State Department and the diplomatic corps protect us in that area?
Good question. I'll just give you an example. In the case of Ebola, the Ebola outbreak, it was our diplomats on the ground that first determined that we needed to get scientific advisors and medical people on the ground as soon as possible. They were the ones to call the CDC in Atlanta, to dispatch doctors. They were the ones that put out a call for volunteers and that sort of thing to get there. And by and large, there were a couple of cases of Ebola here in the United States, but by and large, that was contained. The same thing with avian flu and a lot of the other things that you see going around the world, and the predictions of massive pandemics and deaths and that sort of thing that have never materialized, largely because of the alertness of our diplomats overseas in working with our federal government agencies back here. So a lot of times you don't see the success because nothing happens, okay, or very little happens. I was reminded the other day, I worked in Central America many years ago, and one of the things that we were working on very closely with our own Department of Agriculture, with State Department lead overseas in our embassies, was to try to stop a screwworm infection coming into our dairy cows in the United States, a devastating kind of infection to our milk and other byproducts. We stopped it in its tracks in Guatemala. It was coming up the isthmus into Mexico and then projected to be in the United States with a horrible reaction, and we were able to stop it 1,000 miles before it got to our border. Most people would never even heard of it. Most people have never heard of it. And yet this is the kind of thing that we do every day. We don't take bows for it. We just do our job. And oftentimes we do it in such a way, in cooperation with other governments, that we allow the other government to take the bow, and we stand behind them, okay, and applaud. That was kind of what some Obama staffers, I think, attempted to mean in their inelegant way of saying that we lead from behind. In other words, we put it together, we put the coalition together. Remember, you're strongest when you lead, not when you're acting alone or unilaterally. You're strongest when you're leading a like-minded group of allies towards a particular goal. You're strongest when you lead. And that takes an awful lot of work of bringing countries on board, working behind the scenes, and then oftentimes letting them own the results, the success, and you standing behind them. Because them owning that success and being willing to take a risk again to do the right thing, okay, is far more important than you standing there and taking the bow up front. And that is built into the DNA of America's diplomats.
So let's talk a little bit longer term here in the trend lines. During the Cold War, the State Department budget was roughly half the Pentagon's, I think, during the height. Now the Pentagon budget is something in excess of 10 times state's budget. So what happened?
Well, what happened? That's a good question. We as a country have not yet figured out or determined what our role in the world is. We'd like the world to be a safe place. We would like the world to be prosperous. We would like the world to safeguard our planet Earth. We would like the world to be a lot of what we are here in this country in terms of respect and our own democratic system. But where the uncertainty comes in is, well, how far are we willing to go to achieve that? And I think as a country, particularly now with the election of President Trump, we're still trying to figure out what that means. When I hear America first, what I hear is, yeah, I've always considered America first. And for me, that means leading a group of like-minded countries, or countries of the willing, so to speak, okay, in efforts overseas together, okay, but not necessarily being the one taking the bow for it, as I mentioned earlier. And that's where we're strongest. If we act unilaterally, if we act alone, if the president doesn't put down at least some guiding principles for countries to follow and zigzags all over the map, if he continues to insult our allies publicly, it's going to make it very much harder for him to accomplish the goals and objectives of putting America first. I can't see how it could possibly be done.
So let's, in the last few minutes we have left, talk a little bit about just the sort of bare-knuckled politics of this. Who are the constituents for the State Department, and who are the constituents for the Defense Department? And by this, I'm sort of obliquely referring to the role of sort of pork barrel politics. There are no State Department big-time contractors in Senator X's district. Is that part of the problem?
Well, it is. First of all, you put your finger on it earlier, Doug, when you said that it's easier to understand what the military does than it is what diplomats do behind closed doors and that sort of thing, and the agreements that are hammered out and what it takes to get to yes. The other part of it is that the military has millions of alumni all over the country, in VFW halls and elsewhere, that are willing to do whatever it takes to support a defense budget, and who pay attention to the welfare of soldiers, Marines, and airmen. And I think that the State Department just needs to do a better job with that. You know, with all of the people who go through the Peace Corps, and all of the contractors who work overseas in development, and all the human rights groups, and all of the organizations at the local level, like the World Affairs Council here in Milwaukee and elsewhere, there just needs to be a better job of outreach as to why this is all done. And why we need a robust State Department budget that supports American diplomacy. I'm trying to do a little something myself with a podcast that I'll be launching in the next couple of months called Diplomat, where what I'm trying to do is to get out there in cyberland the idea of what Americans do overseas in a very, kind of human comedy, drama kind of situation that anybody can understand. Because I think that's what's really needed, is to understand what it is we do overseas. But it's going to take a lot of effort. And I'm hoping that this chat and the thousands of other chats that we have around the country over the next couple of years will help to not only for Americans to understand what we diplomats do, but for us to get better in touch with those Americans who feel that they've been somewhat marginalized in the process.
So, assuming the kinds of cuts that were anticipated were to become the law of the land, what are some of the things you would anticipate wouldn't happen that are currently happening now?
Well, I'm not sure you would. First of all, if you were to have a reduction in force, which this would require a couple of thousand people, and remember, the State Department, the American officers and specialists in the State Department are probably not more than about 23,000 people worldwide. That's State Department, all our embassies overseas, all our consulates overseas, everywhere, okay, the international organizations, total. And that includes all Americans. That is top-heavy with security people because of the risk to our embassies and buildings and our personnel overseas. We've had to hire a lot more security people. So they are inordinately a large section of this 25,000. In addition to that, what you have is a loss of expertise, because you just don't all of a sudden come into the State Department and say, I think I'm going to make policy and go overseas and or stay in the department and make policy. You've got to really understand what's been going on, the history of it, the personalities involved, the culture of it, how to move people from no to yes. I mean, every country is different. You've got to build up an expertise, which you do over a 25 to 30 to 35-year career. If the intake is interrupted and the amount of manpower is reduced, you're going to cut deeply into the bone, okay, of that kind of expertise. In addition to that, you won't be there to fund the kinds of things that need to be funded to prevent spillover regionally and spillover into our own country. I mean, do we really need to have more Afghanistans prior to 9/11 where terrorists are being trained and we have no ability to be able to reach into these countries except for the military strike or the special operations? I don't think so. The money goes into keeping people home in Central America and not taking to the roads and trying to penetrate the borders. Food programs, anti-AIDS programs. There is just a host of things that we do and continue to do overseas that are critical to keeping Americans safe and secure at home. That would be not just reduced. Many of these programs would be obliterated.
Well, that's something for taxpayers and voters to keep in mind. Ambassador Peter Romero, thank you for being with us.
Real pleasure, Doug. Thank you.
To our viewers, we'll see you next time on International Focus.
This program is made possible in part by the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, one of America's top research universities, preparing students for today's interdependent world with internationally focused academic and outreach programs.